The compass had been broken for 3 days before Elan Morveth realized it wasn't broken at all. It had belonged to his mother, which was reason enough to carry it regardless of function. A brass instrument, small enough to fit in his palm. The kind of navigational tool that surveyors and field researchers used across the Veldran lowlands where he'd grown up. His mother had been a field cartographer, methodical and sun-weathered. The sort of person who believed that knowing exactly where you were at all times was the foundation of everything else worth doing. Elan had inherited the compass and, broadly, the philosophy, though his application of it tended toward the arcane rather than the geographic. He was, by training and temperament, an arcane surveyor, one of a small and occasionally mocked professional class that mapped magical energy the way cartographers map terrain. Ley lines, ambient, arcane saturation, residual enchantment zones, wild magic pockets. All of it charted, measured, recorded in the overlapping grid notation system he'd developed over 8 years of fieldwork. The Mages Collegium in Veldreth paid him a retainer for his surveys, consulted his maps when planning infrastructure, and treated him with the particular mix of respect and mild condescension, reserved for specialists whose work was indispensable but not quite prestigious. He didn't mind. He had his maps, his instruments, and a 6-year-old brown mule named Axiom, who was philosophically opposed to urgency and had therefore never once contributed to a bad decision. The compass had started spinning on the 3rd morning out from the village of Harwick. In the Ashfen lowlands northeast of Veldreth, 2 weeks of surveying ahead of him, a standard contract measuring ambient arcane levels along the old collapse-era ley conduit that the Collegium believed ran under the fenlands. Standard work. The kind of job where the most dramatic thing that typically happened was finding a slightly higher saturation reading than predicted and writing anomalous. Recommend follow-up in the margins. At dawn on that 3rd morning, the compass needle had left north and begun a slow, continuous rotation. Not spinning freely, not stuck, but moving with deliberate steadiness, as if it had found something more interesting than magnetic north, and was not prepared to apologize for it. His first assumption was field interference from a nearby arcane concentration. This happened occasionally near old, collapse-era infrastructure, where residual enchantment still saturated the soil. He checked his other instruments. His ley line detector, a more sensitive device consisting of a glass tube of resonant crystal dust suspended in neutral oil, showed nothing unusual. His ambient saturation meter, a flat disc of calibrated runite, read normal background levels. Only the compass moved. He spent the day trying to determine if it was mechanical failure. He disassembled it, examined the needle's lodestone for demagnetization, reassembled it. It resumed its rotation the moment he set it on the ground. He wrapped it in lid foil, which should have blocked any external arcane field. It rotated inside the foil. He put it in his pack and observed his other instruments, all normal. He took the compass out. It rotated. On the morning of the 4th day, because he was a surveyor and surveyors followed signals rather than ignored them, he pointed himself in the direction the compass needle indicated and started walking. The Ashfen in late summer was a landscape of complicated beauty, vast flat stretches of copper-brown marsh grass broken by stands of black alder and silver willow. The sky enormous above it, the air humid and thick with the smell of peat and standing water, and the faint mineral tang that saturated ground this close to old ley infrastructure always carried. Herons stood in the shallows with the patience of things that had decided time was not their problem. Dragonflies the size of his hand, a local variant adapted to the magical environment, their wings iridescent with ambient arcane saturation, hovered over the reed beds in loose, glittering clouds. Elan walked northeast, following the compass. Axiom walked behind him with the resigned acceptance of a mule who had been on too many detours to consider this one notable. By midday, the quality of the fen had changed. The grass was still copper-brown, the sky still enormous, but the mineral smell had deepened to something richer, earthier, older, the specific scent of ground that had been saturated with arcane energy long enough for the saturation to become geological. His ambient saturation meter began climbing. His ley line detector showed the crystal dust shifting, the oil developing faint lines of particulate alignment. He was walking along a ley line. Or rather, he was walking along what the collapse-era records described as a ley conduit, one of the deliberate arcane infrastructure channels built during the height of the Old Empire, meant to direct magical energy the way aqueducts directed water. Most of them had degraded beyond function 4 centuries ago. This one, according to the Collegium's preliminary data, should have registered as moderate residual activity at best. His meter was reading 3 times the predicted maximum. He stopped and took a careful, comprehensive reading, full instrument array, which meant sitting cross-legged in the fenland grass with Axiom standing behind him, radiating quiet judgment and working through each instrument methodically. Ambient saturation, high. Ley activity, active, not residual, meaning the conduit was not merely holding old energy but conducting new energy, which was not supposed to be possible in a collapse-era structure this old without significant maintenance. Directional pull, consistent, northeast, strengthening. He wrote everything in his survey notebook, noted the coordinates, added 3 asterisks in the margin. His notation for this requires personal investigation before institutional report, and kept walking. The compass rotated faster as the afternoon aged. By the time the sun dropped behind the western reed beds and turned the fen gold-red and long-shadowed, he had covered another 6 miles northeast and arrived at something he had not expected and was not entirely sure he had vocabulary for. The ground rose. This was, in the Ashfen, unusual enough to note. The fenlands were famously flat, their topography varying by inches rather than feet across vast distances. But ahead of him, the land rose in a long, gradual slope that became unmistakably the remnant of an earthwork, not natural geology. Built, the long-ago shaping of earth into deliberate form, grass-covered and ancient, but structured in the way that human-made things were structured. The curve too even to be erosion, the height too consistent to be chance. And at its crest, half buried in centuries of accumulated peat and root growth, visible only because he was now close enough and the light was low enough to catch the angles, stone. Very old stone, the dark granite of pre-collapse construction, cut in blocks and fitted without mortar in the style that the oldest architectural surveys placed before the founding of the current empire, 4 centuries before the collapse. At minimum. The compass needle was pointing directly at it, and it was no longer rotating, it had stopped. Elan stood at the base of the earthwork, looked up at the buried stones, and felt the thing that had been pulling at him for 4 days resolve into a single clarifying question. Whatever was here had been here long before any current institution knew to map it, and it had called his compass to find it. Axiom leaned forward and ate some of the earthwork grass, which was his traditional response to arriving anywhere. He made camp at the earthwork's base rather than climbing it immediately, which was a decision his mother would have approved of. Survey the perimeter before you enter anything you don't understand, and which gave him time in the long blue dusk of the fenlands to study what he could see without disturbing what he couldn't. Structure was larger than the initial impression suggested. What appeared from a distance to be a simple raised earthwork was, on closer examination, a ring, a circular embankment, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, enclosing an interior space at a level slightly elevated from the surrounding fen. The stone he'd seen was part of an outer facing, visible only where centuries of weather and root growth had shifted the peat covering. The blocks were massive, some of them 4 feet across, fitted with a precision that matched accounts he'd read of pre-collapse construction in the Collegium's historical archive, accounts he'd always found mildly academic and was now finding urgently relevant. His instruments told a specific story. The ambient saturation inside the ring's perimeter, he measured it by positioning himself at the earthwork's gap. A break in the embankment that was clearly the original entrance was not merely high. It was stratified. Layered in the way that geological sediment was layered, each horizontal band corresponding to a different era's magical signature. The bottom layers were old enough that his instruments gave only rough approximations. The upper layers included recognizable collapse-era patterns. And the topmost layer, the most recent, the one actively conducting, was something his calibrated references did not contain a match for. He sat with this for a while, watching the fen darken and the first stars appear. A bittern called somewhere in the reeds. That deep, resonant boom that carried across flat water. The sound of the fen at night asserting its own continuity. Axiom was asleep, which he could tell because the mule's breathing had taken on a specific quality of profound detachment from events. The thing that was actively conducting energy through this site was old. Older than the collapse-era infrastructure that had been built around it. The ley conduit, he now understood, had not been the origin of the energy he'd been following. It had been built to carry the energy coming from here, the way a road was built to carry traffic that had always wanted to move in that direction. The conduit was infrastructure built around a source. And the source was the ring, which meant that whatever was here, the people who built the collapse-era empire had known about it, respected it enough to build around rather than over it, and given that no record of this site existed in any survey he'd ever worked with, had subsequently either lost the knowledge or deliberately omitted it. He wrote this in his notebook under a new heading: what was considered worth centering. In the morning he climbed the earthwork. The interior of the ring was different from the exterior in ways that took him a moment to parse. The grass was the same copper-brown fenland variety, the peat underfoot the same soft give. But the air was stiller, not unnaturally so. Not the absolute stillness of an enclosed space, but quieter than the wind outside suggested it should be. And the smell was layered, the expected peat and mineral, but underneath something drier and older, the scent of stone that had been enclosed for a very long time. At the center of the ring was a flat stone. Not a standing stone, not an altar in any architectural sense he recognized. Just a large, horizontal slab, roughly 6 feet square, fitted flush with the ground but visibly distinct from the peat around it. Its surface was clean of moss and growth, which was impossible for a stone this old in this climate and which his instruments identified, without drama, as an active low-level prestidigitation effect, the most basic of cantrips, used here as maintenance, keeping the stone clear. Maintained by something, continuously, for his saturation readings suggested an extremely long time. He crouched and examined the stone's surface. The marks were not carved. They were a natural variation in the granite, the crystal structure of the rock itself having grown, over an enormous span of time, into a pattern. He had read once in a cosmological text he'd cataloged for a trade, about mineral formations in sites of sustained arcane exposure, the slow crystalline response of stone to magical energy over centuries. But those formations were random, fractal, naturally irregular. These were not random. They were a map, not of the Ashfen. Not of any landscape he recognized immediately. The proportions were different, the coastlines unfamiliar. But it was unmistakably cartographic in intent. Here was a body of water. Here were elevated regions indicated by crystal growth ridges. Here were points of energy concentration marked by the stone's natural inclusions. He sat back on his heels and looked at the map for a long time. Then he heard the sound. It came from the stone itself, not from beneath it, not from the air, but from within the rock, as if the granite had developed an interior. A low, resonant hum, below the threshold of clear hearing but felt in the chest and the back of the teeth. The ley line detector in his hand went from mild activity to full response in the space of 2 seconds. The crystal dust aligning in every possible direction simultaneously, the oil turning the pale gold of maximum arcane saturation. And from the stone's surface, the crystal pattern brightened, not with reflected light, with its own light. Cool white blue, precise, running along the natural crystal veins of the granite as if they'd always been channels, waiting for something to flow through them. He should have stepped back. He recognized this, clearly and without self-deception, as the moment when a prudent field researcher stepped back, made very careful notes, and came back with institutional support and appropriate safety protocols. He did not step back. He put his hand on the stone. The map lit up completely. The hum resolved into something more complex. Not music, not speech, but structured, the way a language was structured before you knew enough of it to extract meaning. Patterned, intentional, and then with no transition, no warning, no dramatic effect, simply a shift. The way understanding sometimes arrived without the intermediate steps of arriving. He knew that he was not alone in the ring. He hadn't been alone since he'd walked through the entrance gap. There was something in the earthwork with him. Not threatening. His physical senses reported nothing visible. His instruments read arcane saturation, but no entity signature. But his particular professional sensitivity, the attunement he developed over 8 years of reading magical landscapes, registered a presence the way you registered weather, not as a concrete form, but as a condition of the air, a quality of the space around him. Ancient, awake, and waiting, with the specific patience of something that had been waiting long enough to have stopped being bothered by it, to see what he would do next. The presence did not communicate in words. This was Elan's first lesson, learned over the following 2 hours, as he sat with his hand on the illuminated stone and worked through. every method he knew for establishing contact with an arcane entity. He tried verbal communication, standard arcane tongue greeting protocols, then common speech, then the two other languages he spoke with any fluency. Nothing responded. He tried the Collegium's formal attunement procedure, which involved a specific sequence of intentional concentration directed toward the entity, a kind of structured announcement of professional credentials. Nothing shifted. He tried, somewhat desperately, simply being quiet and attentive, which was not formally a Collegium protocol but which years of field work had taught him was often more effective than anything with steps. This, finally, produced results. Not words. Impressions, the way a very old book communicated, not through explicit statement, but through the accumulated weight of evidence on every page. He received, sitting with his hand on the mapstone, a sequence of experiences that were not his own and not exactly memories. Sensations of depth, of time moving in layers rather than in sequence, of a perspective that was not humanoid, not because it was alien or hostile to humanoid consciousness, but because it was simply much, much older than the concept of humanoid consciousness, and regarded the distinction with gentle irrelevance. The entity was the ring. More precisely, it was the energy pattern that the ring had been built to contain, or to focus, or to house. He was not yet certain which. It had been here longer than the earthwork, longer than the collapse-era conduit. It had been here, in this specific location, since the fen had been different terrain, since the geography of the land had not yet settled into its current shape. It was not a spirit in the theological sense. It was not a god, not an elemental, not a construct. It was something that the theoretical literature he'd read called a genius loci, a place entity, a consciousness that had grown from and into a specific geography over an enormous span of time. The academic literature on such entities was thin and largely theoretical because genuine genius loci were extraordinarily rare. Most sites claimed to contain them did not. The authentic cases were documented in 3 texts he'd personally handled and 1 he'd only read about, and all 4 agreed on the same fundamental characteristic. A true genius loci was not separate from its location. It was the location's awareness of itself. The Ashfen had been aware of itself for longer than anyone currently living had a framework to measure. This was humbling in a way that Elan, who was not prone to being humbled, recognized as appropriate and did not resist. He spent the rest of the morning building a communication method, not the Collegium's protocols, which the entity either couldn't access or chose not to, but something specific to the situation, worked out empirically, his instruments as a two-way medium. He discovered that if he held the ley line detector near the stone and directed questions, structured, specific questions, the kind with definite answers, the crystal dust responded in patterns he could interpret. Not language, binary. The dust settled or it didn't. Clustered densely or dispersed. Enough, with patience for yes and no and gradations between. The entity understood him. Had understood him since he'd arrived. It had been waiting, with its enormous patient awareness, for someone to arrive with the right instruments and the right disposition. Someone who measured things for a living and was therefore accustomed to receiving information in nonverbal form. The compass had been calling him. Yes, he had not been the first person it had called. The others he couldn't establish how many, but the impression was several, had not stopped, had not entered. Had experienced the pull and decided against it, which the entity registered without judgment. He had entered. He had stayed. He had sat with his hand on the stone in the way that said, without words, I am listening. This, he understood, was the credential that mattered. He was working through a carefully structured sequence of questions about the map on the stone's surface, the unfamiliar geography, the energy concentration points, when his peripheral vision caught movement at the earthwork's entrance gap. His hand came away from the stone reflexively. The stone's light dimmed, not extinguished. The ambient glow of the crystal veins remained, reduced to a steady pulse. The figure in the gap was an elf. Female by bearing and build, dressed in the layered practical clothing of a ranger or long-distance traveler, earth-toned, well-worn, a short bow across her back and a long knife at her hip. Her hair was dark and close-cropped, her ears bearing the characteristic points of her race, her eyes, even at this distance, carrying the particular deep-set calm of elven age. Not young, by any measure, though by human standards the difference between an elf of 70 and an elf of 3 100 was subtle enough to require context. She was standing very still at the gap, and she was looking not at him but at the stone, at the residual crystal glow, with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. He said, because there was no useful way to pretend the situation was normal. "You've been here before." She crossed the ring's interior with the quiet efficiency of someone navigating familiar ground. She stopped 10 feet from the stone and looked at it, and then at him, with a directness that was characteristic of elves who had lived long enough to stop softening their attention. "My grandmother built the entrance," she said. 400 years ago. She was the one who commissioned the ley conduit. A pause. She wanted to make sure it could still be found after the collapse. She knew what this was. She knew what it had been. What it agreed to become. The elf crouched, looking at the stone's surface, the map in the granite. It was already old when her people arrived in the fen. Old when the empire that came before hers arrived. Old when, according to what it told her, the land was a different shape. Elan looked at his instruments, which were still active, the crystal dust settling into its steady ambient response. It told her, it learned, the elf said, over a very long time to communicate with the people who found it. Not with everyone. With the ones who came in and stayed. She looked up at him. "My grandmother called it a living record. Everything that has happened in this landscape, for as long as it's been aware, it carries it. All of it. The way a fen carries sediment. In layers, intact, oldest at the bottom." She paused. She believed it was the most complete record of this region's history in existence. What does it want? The elf looked at the stone, then at him. Something in her expression shifted. The calm remained, but something more specific moved through it. "My grandmother asked it the same question. It answered her, eventually." A pause. "It wants what every memory wants. To be known. To have the knowing pass forward." She gestured at the map. "That is not a map of this fen. That is a map of this land before the sea came in. Before the rivers changed course. Before the fen was a fen." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "It has been carrying that map for longer than any civilization I know of has existed. It has been waiting for someone with the right instruments." She glanced at his array. "And the right patience to read it." The hum from the stone resumed, lower and steadier than before. The crystal veins brightened slightly, warmly. Elan thought, in the way that a lamp brightened when someone entered a room. "I'm a surveyor," he said. "I make maps." "I know," she said. "I've been watching the compass for 3 days. Watching to see if you'd follow it." He looked at her. She looked back. "Your grandmother left instructions," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "She left a compass," the elf said, "made from stone taken from this ring. Calibrated to call the right person when the time came." A pause. "My name is Fela. My grandmother was Velith, first cartographer of the Ashfen Compact. She died believing that what this site carries deserved a full record, a proper survey, in a language current people could read." She looked at the stone. "She waited 200 years for the right person. I've been waiting another 2. The hum deepened. The crystal map pulsed once, very gently, as if acknowledging something. Elan opened his survey notebook to a fresh page. "How much does it have to show us?" The pulse came again, longer, and the crystal glow spread across the stone's surface in a slow wave, illuminating regions of the map he hadn't yet examined, detail becoming visible in the granite that he hadn't seen before. Ancient coastlines. River systems, settlements, marked by clustered inclusions. And at the center, a configuration of lines that his surveyor's eye recognized, with a chill of professional awe, as a ley network unlike anything in any current record. Larger, older, more complete. "I think," Fela said, "it has been waiting to show someone everything." Outside the ring, the fen stretched calm and enormous under the open sky. A heron crossed the horizon in its long, slow arc. The bitterns were quiet. The dragonflies drifted in their glittering, saturated clouds over the reed beds. And in the center of the ring, between a half-elf surveyor who measured things for a living and an elf who had waited 200 years for him to arrive, the ancient stone began to give up its record. The record the genius loci carried did not transfer quickly or cleanly, or in a sequence that corresponded to any conventional archive system Elan had ever worked with. It arrived in the way of very old knowledge, not organized for retrieval, but organized for truth, which was a different architecture entirely. Layers of experience rather than categories of fact. Sensation and pattern rather than statement. He and Fela worked together, over 2 full days in the ring, developing the translation. She was the interpreter, in the way that someone raised with a language was an interpreter. She had learned from her grandmother the particular receptive practice of sitting with the stone and allowing impression rather than seeking information. Elan was the transcriber, in the way that a surveyor was a transcriber, converting impression into notation, sensation into coordinate, pattern into legible form. They divided the work without discussing it, finding the natural boundary of their respective competencies and working up to it from both sides. The stone showed them, in no particular order, the geography of the fenlands before the last significant coastal shift, approximately 6,000 years prior, coastlines 2 miles further inland. A river delta now entirely silted over, lowland forests that had become fen when the drainage failed. 3 distinct periods of human habitation before the current civilization. Not the old empire, not the collapse-era builders, but older communities whose traces existed only in this record and in the faint, incomprehensible modifications to the landscape that Elan had always filed. As anomalous topographical features, origin unclear. They were not anomalous. They were architecture, millennia out of use, and the ley network. The complete ley network, as it had existed before the collapse-era builders deliberately narrowed and channeled it for their own infrastructure. It was 3 times larger than current surveys indicated. It connected points across the entire region in a web of mutual reinforcement. Not channels designed to carry energy one direction, but a living network, self-regulating, responsive to natural cycles. The collapse-era builders had harvested it, taken its energy for their own purposes, left the remainder in the degraded state that current scholars called the normal baseline. This was not the normal baseline. This was the aftermath. Elan wrote without stopping, his wrist aching by the end of the first day, his handwriting deteriorating into the cramped shorthand he used when volume demanded speed over elegance. Fela translated with her eyes closed, her hands resting on the stone's surface, describing in measured, careful sentences what she received. She did not volunteer interpretation. She did not editorialize. She was, he recognized, a better field worker than most professionals he'd collaborated with, because she had learned the hardest discipline of information work, saying what you found rather than what you expected. On the second afternoon, something changed. The record had been flowing backward, oldest material last, recent material first, in the way that memory sometimes moves toward its sources. And as it reached the deepest layers, the quality of what Fela described shifted from informational to something more immediate. Less this happened and more this is happening. Present tense, in the sensation of a being for whom time was not sequential but accumulated. It's showing me something different, she said. Her voice was steady but changed in some register beneath steadiness. Not history. Current. Elan set down his pen. Current activity? Current awareness. She was quiet for a moment, and the stone's hum shifted, rising slightly in pitch. It knows the ley network is degraded. Has known for 400 years? It knows because the degradation affects it directly. This site is a node of the original network. When the collapse-era builders channeled the ley lines away from here, this site lost the majority of its connections. She paused. It's been reduced. For 400 years, it's been operating on a fraction of what it was. Another pause. It's been waiting for someone to know that. To have the full record of what existed before, and to understand what was taken. Elan looked at his survey notebook. 40 pages of notes. The most complete arcane survey of this region ever conducted. The original ley network, fully mapped, every connection, every node, every point where the old web had been cut. He understood what the stone was telling him. Not as a demand, not as a plea. As information offered with the patient confidence of something that had learned. Over 6,000 years of awareness that information well given eventually found the right hands. The ley network could, in theory, be restored. Not all at once, the infrastructure work required would take years, institutional cooperation, significant arcane engineering. But the knowledge of how to restore the original configuration, the connection points, the specific geometry of a self-regulating system was all here, in his notebook, translated from 6,000 years of accumulated awareness. It gave us the record, he said slowly, because the record is the tool for repairing what was broken. Fela opened her eyes. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something layered, as old things tended to be layered. My grandmother understood that eventually. She didn't have the instruments to survey the full network. She didn't have the training for the arcane engineering. She built the conduit as a partial restoration, a single connection, to keep this node alive. And she made the compass, a pause, calibrated to call someone who could do more. The stone's hum had dropped back to its deep, resonant base. The crystal veins pulsed steadily, not urgently, not impatiently. The patience of something that had been waiting for 6 millennia was not the anxious patience of something that feared not being answered. It was the patience of something that understood with geological certainty that what was true would eventually be recognized. Elan closed his notebook. He held his mother's compass that was not, as it turned out, his mother's compass, but a compass made from a ringstone 400 years ago by a cartographer who had been waiting for him specifically. He turned it over in his hands and felt, for the first time since he'd found the door in the restricted annex. No, that was another story. Since he'd stood at the earthworks base on that golden evening, the specific, clarifying sensation of a survey that had found its full extent. Not the end. The full extent. The shape of how much there was still to do, which was enormous, and the knowledge of where to start, which made it manageable. He looked at Fela. I'm going to need institutional support. The Collegium will have opinions. They will, she agreed. My grandmother dealt with that too. She left notes. A faint, dry expression crossed her face. Extensive notes. I'm going to need a co-surveyor, he said. Someone who can continue the communication while I handle the technical mapping. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stone. The stone pulsed, once. That warm, ambient pulse he'd come to recognize as acknowledgement. I've been tending this site for 200 years, she said. I know the fen in every season. I know what the Huron patterns tell you about the ley saturation levels and where the ground is stable enough to build on and which sections of the embankment need reinforcement every spring. She looked at him with the direct, unlayered attention she'd had. Since she arrived, I've been waiting for a surveyor. You've been following a compass. A pause. I think that constitutes a working partnership. He put out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Elves, in his experience, had complicated feelings about human formality conventions, and then took it with a grip that was firm and brief and meant what it said. The stone's hum deepened. The crystal map illuminated fully, every line and node and ancient coastline clear in the low afternoon light, the fen's old bones made visible for the first time in 4 centuries. Outside the ring, the dragonflies drifted. The Huron called. The light went long and amber across the copper grass. Elan Morveth, Arcane surveyor, opened his notebook to a fresh page and began the first map of what the Ashfen had been and what, with enough time and enough patience and the right institutional memos, it might be again. The first formal paper Elan submitted to the Magus Collegium of Veldrath was 11 pages long, conservatively worded, entitled Anomalous Arcane Activity in the Northern Ashfen, a preliminary survey of pre-collapse ley infrastructure. He had written preliminary deliberately, because preliminary implied more was coming and forced institutional acknowledgement without triggering the defensive response that the full implications of his findings might otherwise have produced immediately. It produced a defensive response anyway, but a smaller one than he'd anticipated. The section on a previously unrecorded genius loci of significant age caused the most turbulence. 3 senior members of the Collegium requested independent verification, which Elan provided in the form of Fela, who attended the verification session with 200 years of personal observation records, and the kind of patient, detailed response to skepticism that suggested she had answered these questions before, in other institutions in other centuries. The verification was accepted. The independent survey, conducted by a Collegium team that Elan accompanied and that Fela, to the team's visible unease, did not leave unattended at the ring for a single hour, confirmed every finding in the preliminary paper and produced, as a side effect, 3 additional papers from team members who had not expected to find anything interesting and were now professionally committed to the site. The full network survey took 4 years. Elan mapped every node, every severed connection, every point where the original ley geometry had been diverted by the collapse-era infrastructure. Fela translated and Elan recorded, season by season, working outward from the ring in the methodical grid pattern he'd been trained in, his instruments growing more sophisticated as the Collegium's investment in the project grew. His mother's compass, Velith's compass, he thought of it now, though he kept it in his pocket always, no longer spun. It sat quiet and still, pointing reliably north, its work complete. Axiom the mule retired after the second year of the survey, not because he was old, but because he had developed an opinion about standing in the fen while Elan spent 8 hours reading a single node, and had communicated this opinion through the sustained, expressive medium of mule silence. Elan found him a good home with a vegetable farmer outside Harwick, who reported that Axiom was an excellent judge of character and had, on one occasion, pointedly refused to carry a cart past the section of road that subsequently collapsed. Old habits. The restoration began in the 6th year, which was faster than Elan had anticipated and slower than Fela had hoped, and which involved a coalition of arcane engineers, the Collegium, 2 neighboring city-states whose own lay infrastructure turned out to be branches of the same original network, and a surprisingly productive series of meetings with a dwarven geological survey team from Dusk Hollow, who had been independently puzzled by their own anomalous readings for the better part of a decade. The first connection was restored on a clear morning in early autumn, a single lay thread, re-established between the ring and a node 3 miles east, following the geometry of the original network. The technical process was careful, multi-stage, properly documented. But the moment of restoration was not technical. It was the moment when the ley line detectors across the entire survey grid lit up simultaneously, a ripple of response. Node to node, the network remembering its own shape. In the ring, the crystal map on the flat stone glowed. Not its usual steady pulse, a full, warm, sustained illumination that lasted for approximately 40 seconds and then settled back to its normal rhythm, slightly brighter than before. Fela, who had seen a great many things in 200 years and had learned to receive them with composure, stood with her eyes closed and her hands on the stone for a long time afterward. When she opened them, she said nothing. But her expression was the expression of someone for whom a very long wait had been answered. Not ended, because the work was not finished, but answered. The answer that meant the ending was now possible. Elan stood beside her and looked at the map in the stone. The ancient coastlines, the lost rivers. The original network in its full, intact geometry, still 6,000 years old, still patient, now beginning to be real again. His survey notebook, the third one by now, the first 2 filed in the Collegium's archive under a new classification, was in his hand. He wrote the date. He wrote the coordinates. He wrote in the margin 3 asterisks. And then, because he was a surveyor and surveyors recorded the full extent of what they found, he wrote below the asterisks in the small, precise handwriting he developed over years of fieldwork. The fen remembers everything. We are only learning to ask it. The stone hummed. The dragonflies drifted, iridescent in the late autumn light. The Huron stood in the shallows, patient and still, as it always had. The fen was very old and it had learned at last to be known. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não estas inho, dic su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram. Escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.